Again, I'm Frank Shinneman. I'm with the Marin chapter of the ACLU, and to give you a little history on where this came from. Last October, I was reading the agendas on the Board of Supervisors meeting and noticed that they were going to approve a contract with Global Telelink, GTL, which is the company that provides all the communication systems for the jail. And so I clicked it open and started quickly reading. And it showed up very quickly that they guaranteed $160,000 per year back to the county of something they call revenue sharing. Some people would call it a kickback. And then you read a little further, and that's based on 80% return of whatever is spent on phone calls. So it gives you an idea of how many phone calls you're going through. So that got our interest, and we started digging in farther to find out what is this system, what is the contract, how does it work? And what I'm going to do in this presentation is take you through the follow the money presentation of what is the Inmate Welfare Fund, which is where this money eventually goes, and what is done with it. What I thought I'd do is go through the presentation and then take questions after I describe it fully, because it's a step-by-step presentation to get through, and most of the questions will be answered along the way. So who really benefits is the big question here. The Inmate Welfare Fund was set up, I think, back in the 90s. It's been around for a long time. And the basis of it was in the tough on crime 90s, 3 strikes and you're out, and inmates deserve nothing, and there were no inmate reentry services or any other services for inmates. And the California state legislature said, the people who run the commissary and the phones are making huge, huge profits, because basically they have people trapped and they have no place else to go. And so they deserve to be required to share some of their profits back for the benefits of the inmates. And we'll set up something called an Inmate Welfare Fund and legislate that any profits made off of inmates will come back, at least part of them, will come back to the inmates for their own welfare. Not too surprisingly, as things moved forward, those companies simply raised their prices so that they could claim they were giving back huge amounts and still make the profits that they wanted to make. And that gives us the Inmate Welfare Fund that receives 80% of the cost of phone calls that is collected back to the Inmate Welfare Fund, and obviously still gives a big profit to the company that runs the communications. The only source of money that ultimately ends up in the Inmate Welfare Fund is from friends and families and the inmate themselves. The inmates' families and friends can use a credit card or a debit card to deposit the money, but what you find out quickly after you do that is that your bank that issued you the credit card or the debit card doesn't consider it a simple debit or credit. They consider it a cash advance, and they charge money for cash advances. And right now, the average for most banks is a minimum of $10 or 5% of whatever that cash advance is. And that goes right to the bank, not to the communications company, not to the jail, not to the Inmate Welfare Fund, which is a bit of a surprise for a lot of people to see that come in and hit them. The next thing we look at is where the money can be deposited. So if you've got a friend in jail and you want to put something into their account so they can spend it at the commissary or for telephone calls, you've got 3 choices. All inmates are given their own trust account that someone can deposit money into directly, and they can use it for anything that they're allowed to buy inside the jail. If you do that, you go through a company called Access Corrections, and they take a fee. If you want to simply deposit into a telephone account so you can stay in touch with someone, you can go to GTL's website and deposit there, and they charge a fee. And if you want to simply give someone money for their commissary for food, movies, a variety of things, you can deposit into the Access account directly. Now, the maximum you can put in is about $300 per day. If you put it into the phone account, you end up paying $3 per deposit. Any deposit you put in, you'll be paying $3. Access for the commissary or for the trust account charges $3 for up to a $20 deposit and $6 for between $20 and $100. So most people seem to put in a fairly small amount because if nothing else, you worry about them being able to get the money back out if it's not spent when they're finally released. So imagine spending $3 to put in $20 so that you could then have a telephone call for another $3. So there's a huge amount of money being taken out of the system. Inmates can then spend the money in their accounts on either basically communications or in the commissary. So we see here that from the trust account, this is the trust account, they can go to either place, either to the phone or to the commissary. From the GTL account, the money can only be spent on phones. From the Access commissary account, it can only be spent at the commissary. And then this is where the money comes back to the Inmate Welfare Fund. Because when GTL contract says that a minimum of $160,000 per year will come back to the county, it's not really to the county because state code also requires that all profits that come back to the county from the inmates has to go into the Inmate Welfare Fund. So that's how the money ultimately gets into the Inmate Welfare Fund. I've got the contract and all the numbers on the GTL flow of money, but I don't have it on the commissary contract. I do know, though, from looking at the financials, that that's a smaller portion of what goes into the Inmate Welfare Fund. So, excuse me. Where is the IWF money spent? So it's supposed to be for inmate welfare programs. Now, in the 90s, there weren't many of those. Today, there's a lot of different inmate programs paid for by a number of different kinds of funds. AB 109 funds are $5 million per year for each county. There's just a number of programs. But if we look at specifically where the Inmate Welfare Fund money goes, the first place it goes is 42% of it to a jail administrator who takes care of the fund, decides who gets the money that's in the fund and where it goes. It can only be spent on inmate welfare, but somebody's got to take the money in, take the money go back out. Well, 42% is a large percentage of the annual money going through the Inmate Welfare Fund. It's actually a fairly small amount of money. It's $87,000 over the last 3 years on average per year. And that includes all of the salary and benefits. So that's really one administrator who's taking care of this. A small amount of it is spent on miscellaneous vendors, a little under 10%, 7-Up, Costco, Walmart, and some legal aid. But the biggest piece of the Inmate Welfare Fund each year is spent with the two vendors who put the money in, GTL Phone and Access Commissary. That's based on the last 3 years' averages. So down below, you can see 49% goes to one of these two companies, not paid to them like a fee, but rather it goes back to them through phone calls and through commissary purchases. So the place that the inmate can spend the money is on a phone call, or he can spend it at the commissary, because there are just not many other places to spend the money. The 10% that goes to some of these other minor companies are for things like Christmas cards. The jail buys a bunch of Christmas cards, envelopes, and stamps and hands them out around Christmas for people to send cards to their family. So the inmate isn't buying it directly, but that's one of the benefits that the jail manages themselves. And there's a few others. Presumably from 7-Up, they buy some snacks and drinks that they hand out that don't have to be purchased. So really, as opposed to an inmate welfare fund, I think it's a vendor welfare fund, because look at where the money came from. The only money that comes into the system is from inmates, families, and friends, or themselves. And along the way, they pay fees to the bank first, then to Access and GTL. All of the money goes to either administration in the jail or back to basically those same two vendors. So all but 9% goes to those two vendors, and the last 9% also goes to other vendors. But these are the two guys who put in the most money and they get it right back out. So not all money is spent each year. There's a lot of money that goes into the system. And if we look at the last 5 years of financials, what comes out is that there's actually $1.2 million sitting there unspent in the Inmate Welfare Fund. And that came from some time back. The last couple of years have been basically break-even years. And so maybe the phone call amounts were higher or the contract was different in the past. The most recent contract was only signed a year ago. But if we look at that 1.2 million that's sitting there being unspent and say, well, how much is spent by the inmates on phone calls each year? There's 13 years worth of phone calls that could be made with that $1.2 million. So if you look at the equity, who is this happening to? You probably already know the story. 72% at latest count of the current inmates are pre-trial. They're simply waiting for a trial. They haven't been convicted of anything. Why are they there? Because they can't afford the bail to get back out. The vast majority are there on misdemeanors, not on felonies. So why are we charging these captive, most poor people in our economy these excessive prices? And even if they were getting more benefits than just another phone call, why do the poor inmates have to finance their own services and pay even more than can be spent over a number of years? So that's where I want to stop for a minute and see if you've got any questions about the basic system that's going through, and then I'll talk about some of the solutions.
So 70% of current inmates are waiting for court. Does this include people in state prisons who are back at the court for retrials?
Probably yes, although I think that the majority in the flow are first time going through. I mean, they may have had prior convictions, but they're not already within the system.
Okay, so that could be.
But regardless of whether they are or not, they're in waiting for trial.
Yeah, right.
In our jail, they're not in another jail, and when they're finished there, then they'll be transferred here for a different kind of trial.
And then, so in the 91%, do we know what the admin, that quote unquote admin that the jail is? Is that simply, what is the admin for the IWF?
It's salary and benefits.
For
so
like
$87,000. So it's, it can't be more than a person, because if you take the pension benefits, they have eyewear, they have dental, they have health, there's a huge number of benefits that go into every jail salary. And so if you start looking at $87,000 and take that out, you got to be taking out at least a quarter, probably 35% of that, which means the salary someone's taking home is instead down around, what, $40,000, maybe $50,000?
Yeah, so do we know who that administrator is?
No.
I don't know anything about that. Okay.
And in looking at the system, I mean, we also don't know how the administrator hands out the chits for more phone or for commissary. Does everyone get a piece of it? Does everyone who has spent money get a piece of it? Does a trustee decide who gets the favored card or commissary fund? The reason that we haven't focused on that, even though it might be egregious, is it's small. The basic problem here is we're charging people excessive amounts for a phone call, and we're charging them fees all the way along the path of getting the money in to pay for those things. That's just wrong. And so if you take it away, all the other problems disappear, if you can get rid of that whole process. So let me go through, that's a good jump into what can be done about it. San Francisco, as a city, and county said their jail will have free phone calls and will cut down the cost of commissary items. It was announced about 3 months ago. I think it's already taken place. And I've thrown in a quote from Mayor Breed. The sheriffs also said good things about it. They believe that it's not only the right thing to do, but that it actually helps families stay together so that when they ultimately are released, they can make a better re-entry into society. New York City did the same thing for the city jail earlier in the summer. And here's their mayor's statement as well, that it's a general benefit to everyone. California SB 555 has been proposed, but is in committee. It'll maybe be a 2-year bill to reduce the jail phone and commissary charges and to eliminate the fees that are paid. But it doesn't, it reduces them some. It's a nice gesture, but it doesn't take away the cost. Certainly would do nothing for the bank fee. And similarly, Connecticut legislature proposed in a 2-year bill free jail and prison calls for all jails in the state. So again, the solution that I think we should propose to our Board of Supervisors who signed the contract is to use the $1.2 million balance to make phone calls free. If you start paying for the phone calls out of that reserve money, it'd take 13 years at the current rate to use it up. And the calculation for that is, these are numbers from the current jail commander. Their call revenue is going to be around $330,000 per year is his estimate. The county's commission is 80% of that. And if you do the math quickly, it's not actually 80% because they also get some other money thrown in from movies, from books that they can get on an iPad, from those kind of things. So the net cost that the vendor is left with after he kicks back the 80% is only $87,000 per year. So 87,000 into the 1.2 million gives you a little over 13 years. And below are some quotes right out of the contract showing that the kickback will be 80% revenue share and a minimum of $160,000 per year. So if we did that, then the next step is obviously to look at other costs that are in the jail and to reduce those. So GTL kicks back a different amount, a different percentage on movies, on books, on the various things that they can get on an iPad. And we don't yet know what the numbers are on the commissary. I only know that they're much smaller than what comes through the phone company. But similarly, there's a kickback on the commissary, and the commissary charges are also quite high. And in the end, what do we get out of it? Not only is it the morally right thing to do, but everyone has confirmed through lots of studies, keeping family connections aids reentry. And your point early on, Robbie, about having visitation where a father can touch a child, you can imagine, you don't have to imagine if you go to the jail much, a 4 or 5 year old with mom visiting dad in jail, who may not be convicted of anything, but may sit in there for 6 or 9 months waiting to get to trial.